Okay, let's unpack this. There are some images from mythology that are just um, seared into our minds, aren't there?
Oh, definitely.
And perhaps none more vividly than Medusa.
Yeah.
Snakes for hair, eyes that turn you to stone.
Right.
She's the ultimate monster, right? A figure of pure horror. That's the picture most of us have, I think.
It really is. That's the dominant image, in popular culture today, the terrifying Gorgon, just the face of pure, unadulterated monstrousness.
But what if that's only like part of the story? What if the deeper truth is far more layered, complex,
Oh,
and
dear.
maybe even profoundly tragic?
Uh-huh.
What if she wasn't born a monster, but was made into one by circumstances, by powers far greater and maybe far less just than she was?
Her story is such a prime example of how myths evolve, how they gather meaning over time. It touches on so many fundamental human themes.
Yeah.
Beauty and horror, divine power, and its, well, often arbitrary application.
Uh-huh.
Injustice, victimhood.
Perception itself, right? Like what makes something monstrous? How do we judge it?
Exactly. It's all wrapped up in there.
Exactly. And today we're taking a deep dive into the myth of Medusa. We've got quite a stack of sources here, articles, research, explorations, stuff that spans classical mythology, art history, psychology, philosophy, even modern cultural analysis.
Yeah, it's a rich tapestry. And our mission really is to extract the most important nuggets, the key insights from all this material.
Right.
We're going to explore the different versions of her tale, try to understand the dramatic shifts in how she's been depicted across centuries.
Which are pretty significant.
Oh, huge. And dig into why she remains such a potent and, well, relevant figure. I mean, she inspires everything from high art to feminist reclamation, even today.
So think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to being truly well-informed on the Gorgon, who is far, far more than just, a scary face designed to turn you to stone. Let's dive in.
Let's do it. So maybe we should start, as the sources kind of invite us to, at the earliest beginnings of the myth, or at least the earliest recorded versions we have access to.
Right, the traditional origins. Before any idea of a transformation story really takes hold, how is Medusa presented in those oldest tales?
Well, in the most foundational Greek myths, like Hesiod's Theogony, Medusa is introduced pretty simply. She's one of three sisters, the Gorgons.
Medusa, Stheno, and Uriel.
Exactly, the infamous trio.
Okay, and the sources really make a point about their parentage, don't they? It's quite a lineage.
It absolutely sets the stage. According to Hesiod and later writers like Apollodorus, the Gorgons were the children of primordial sea deities, Phorcys and Ceto.
Phorcys and Ceto. Okay, ring a bell. Gods of...
Well, Phorcys is often seen as a god of the hidden dangers of the deep sea, the lurking threats beneath the waves.
Right.
And Ceto is his sister and consort, a goddess of sea monsters and other perils of the ocean.
So right from birth, their very essence is tied to the ancient, untamed, dangerous parts of the sea. They come from a line that's inherently monstrous, or at least associated with deep, primal fear.
Precisely. Their parentage firmly roots them in that realm, the monstrous, the liminal, the edge of the known world where dangers live.
Uh-huh.
And the sources mention their family tree is, well, extensive and pretty remarkable. Their siblings included the Grey.
Oh, yeah, the three old sisters sharing one eye and one tooth. Creepy.
Exactly. And Thusa, mother of the Cyclops Polyphemus. Scylla, the six-headed sea monster. Ladon, the dragon guarding the golden apples. Even the Hesperides nymphs.
Wow. It's less a family and more like a bestiary of ancient dangers.
It's certainly a lineage steeped in the monstrous and the perilous, but there's a really vital distinction among the three Gorgon sisters, highlighted in the sources, that's absolutely crucial for Medusa's unique story.
Okay, what's that?
Of the three sisters, Medusa was the only mortal one.
Oh.
Her sisters, Stheno and Uriel, they were immortal, and this mortality, this is key to why her fate unfolds the way it does. She can be killed.
Right, that makes sense. So what about the early physical descriptions? Were they always just snake-haired, or was it more out there?
In the very earliest sources, like Hesiod and Homer, the descriptions focus more on their fearful nature and their remote location than super detailed physical appearance.
So less about the looks, more about the vibe.
Yeah. Hesiod and Apollodorus just sort of place these offspring of Phorcys and Ceto beyond framed Oceanus at the world's hard edge by night, emphasizing their connection to the primordial, the remote, the scary unknown.
Okay, but Aeschylus, he gives us the snake hair pretty early on, right?
Yes, Aeschylus, writing a bit later, describes them in Prometheus Bound as winged sisters, loathed enemies of humankind, the snake-haired Gorgons whom no man can see and live.
Whom no man can see and live. That pretty much nails the deadly gaze part, too.
It does. It solidifies that iconic snake-haired image early on, along with their lethal power. You look, you die, or turn to stone, depending on the version.
And Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, he mentions the Gorgon's head, the Gorgonian, specifically as a symbol of, like, immense terror, right?
Yeah.
Often on Athena's shield.
Absolutely. Homeric descriptions really emphasize the horror. In the Iliad, Athena's Aegis shield has the head of the grim, gigantic Gorgon, a thing of fear and horror.
Grim, gigantic Gorgons. Nice alliteration.
Yeah. And in the Odyssey, Odysseus fears Persephone might send the Gorgon's head up from the underworld. It's like the ultimate image of dread.
So in these foundational myths, Medusa and her sisters are primarily just terrifying, formidable beings, born monstrous, embodying dread from the edges of the world. No transformation narrative yet.
Exactly. And Pseudo-Apollodorus, who sort of summarized a lot of earlier traditions, gives us maybe the most composite and vivid early physical description. He describes them having heads with scaly serpents coiled around them.
Okay, snakes check.
And large tusks like those of swine.
Tusks, like a boar.
Yep. And hands of bronze and wings of gold.
Tusks and bronze hands. Wow. That's way more primal and grotesque than just snakes and a deadly look. Sounds much more like a full-on monster.
It does. These early descriptions really paint them as physically grotesque, horrifying creatures. Fully formed monsters right from the start, fitting right in with their dangerous sea god parents.
And the name Gorgon itself fits this perfectly, right? What does the word actually mean?
Yeah, the word Gorgon comes from the ancient Greek gorgos, which it translates roughly as grim, fierce, or terrible.
So literally the terrible ones.
Pretty much. It directly reflects how they were seen in these early myths, terrifying beings. Though interestingly, Medusa's own name, Medusa, comes from a Greek word meaning to guard or to protect.
Huh. That's fascinating, given the later use of her head as a protective symbol. The Gorgonian on Athena's shield, like a hint hidden in her name.
It's a neat little linguistic echo, yeah, even if the early myths just focus squarely on the terror.
So the initial picture is clear. Figures of dread, born monstrous, embodying terror from the deep, the unknown. But then, like you said, the narrative takes this dramatic turn. A completely different origin story pops up for Medusa's monstrous form.
This is where the story shifts, like really significantly. And it's influenced most powerfully by later writers, especially the Roman poet Ovid in his big work, The Metamorphoses.
Ah, Ovid. He tends to add drama.
He certainly does. And his version adds this layer of tragedy and pathos that just wasn't really there in the earlier accounts. It's the version that, for many people, is the Medusa story now.
And Ovid gives us the narrative where Medusa wasn't always this terrifying creature.
Exactly. In Ovid's very influential version, Medusa starts out not as a monster, but as a, well, stunningly beautiful mortal maiden. The sources really emphasize her extraordinary beauty, specifically highlighting her amazing hair, renowned for it.
So the very thing that becomes the symbol of her monstrosity, the snakes, was originally her crowning glory, her greatest beauty. That's a tragic irony right there.
A profound one, absolutely. And crucially, Ovid's account and the ones influenced by it, they place her in a specific, really significant setting. She was a priestess serving in the temple of Minerva.
Minerva, the Roman equivalent of the Greek Athena.
Right. So as a priestess of Minerva, she's dedicated to a life of purity, chastity, serving right there in the goddess's sacred temple.
That setting just adds so much weight to the tragedy, doesn't it? A sacred temple dedicated to a virgin goddess of wisdom and war, and inside, a beautiful young priestess sworn to purity. It really elevates the sanctity of the place and Medusa's vulnerability within it.
It raises the stakes immensely, and the sources detail this pivotal, catastrophic event that changes everything. Neptune.
The Roman Poseidon, god of the sea.
Right. He sees Medusa is overcome by lust, and he forcibly assaults her, and the sources make it a critical point. This violation happens inside the sacred temple of Minerva.
So it's a double violation, a horrific personal trauma for Medusa, obviously, and a direct, deliberate desecration of Athena's holy ground, a massive insult to the goddess herself.
It is a profound affront on multiple levels. Violates Medusa, violates her vows, utterly defiles the sanctity of Athena's temple and her divine honor. The sources suggest motivations from just Neptune's sheer lust to maybe the ongoing rivalry between Poseidon and Athena.
Okay, so how does Minerva Athena react to this huge offense committed in her most sacred space?
Her reaction, as Ovid describes it, is one of intense rage, fury. A goddess like Athena embodying wisdom, justice, order, would be absolutely enraged by the defilement of her sanctuary, the violation of her space, her priestess.
And here's where it gets, well, really interesting and frankly deeply unsettling for a lot of modern readers. The sources, following Ovid, point out this profound paradox in Athena's response. The goddess's wrath, her punishment. It falls not on the aggressor, Poseidon Neptune, who actually did the violating and desecrating.
Nope.
It falls squarely on the victim, Medusa.
This is probably the most debated, most tragic part of Ovid's story, and a huge focus of modern reinterpretation. The goddess directs her fury at the one who was violated in her temple, not the one who did the violating.
Why? I mean, why would a goddess of wisdom and justice do that? The sources suggest some reasons, but they feel thin.
Yeah, they often feel unsatisfying. Maybe Athena did it to remove Medusa's beauty, which attracted Neptune, and might attract others, causing more trouble or defilement, or maybe to make her so terrifying that no one would dare approach the desecrated space again.
It feels like this twisted kind of divine justice, punishing the innocent for the crime committed against them, maybe to protect the goddess's own honor, or just remove the problem, which in this story gets framed as Medusa's beauty.
It is explicitly framed in some modern analyses, drawing on these sources as just unjust and cruel. It strips Medusa of her humanity, her agency, turns her into this terrifying symbol of isolation and death.
And the punishment itself is devastating. The transformation.
Yeah, her beautiful hair, once admired,
turned into a writhing mass of venomous snakes. The sources say this transformation of her best feature was like the core of the curse, turning beauty into horror in her eyes. Once lovely, maybe drawing glances.
They gain that terrifying power to turn anyone who looks directly into them into stone. And the sources stress, this wasn't a superpower she wanted, it was a curse, a devastating burden that cut her off completely from any human connection.
Just imagine that. Your gaze, the thing you use to connect with people, becomes this weapon you can't control. You doom anyone you look at. You can't make eye contact, ever, without destroying them, turning them into these lifeless stone statues.
It's an existence defined by involuntary destruction and total isolation. And after this horrifying transformation, Medusa's fate is exile. The sources describe her being banished from human society, sent off to live on some remote, desolate island, sometimes called an abhorrent place, just far from everything.
Her only companions being the statues, the petrified figures of anyone unlucky enough or maybe foolish enough to stumble onto her island and meet her gaze.
Which just makes her torment and loneliness worse, right? She's trapped in this cursed existence, a living monument to the injustice she suffered. And this Ovidian version really sharpens the contrast with her sisters.
Right. Stheno and Uriel were born Gorgons, always monstrous, out there on the edge of the world.
But Medusa was made into one. Her monstrosity is a direct result of divine punishment for being a victim.
That distinction is so key to understanding the later interpretations, why her story has such lasting power. In this version, she isn't inherently evil. Her horror comes from suffering, from injustice.
It really solidifies her as the epitome of the tragic monster. A being whose terrifying form, whose power, is the direct result of being violated and then unfairly punished by a powerful, flawed god. Her story, in this telling, really forces you to confront the unsettling morality of the Greek gods sometimes. They don't always act justly, do they?
No, sometimes they punish the innocent, the victim, for offenses committed against them or their sacred space. It's uncomfortable.
So you have this stark contrast, the early born monster narrative versus the later Ovidian tragic victim story. It's a massive shift in how she's understood, bringing in all these layers of sympathy and critique.
And it's this tragic monster figure that the hero Perseus is eventually fated to encounter and, well, slay.
Exactly. Which brings us to the hero's quest part of the story.
Right. So how does Perseus get tangled up in this? What makes him go after such a terrifying creature?
Well, the sources tell us Perseus was sent on this incredibly dangerous mission by King Polydectes of Seriphos. Now, Polydectes had his eye on Perseus' mother, Danae, wanted to marry her.
Okay.
But Perseus was protective of his mother, saw Polydectes for what he was, and basically stood in the way.
So Polydectes needed to get Perseus out of the picture and figured sending him after Medusa was a pretty good way to do that permanently.
Exactly. A classic impossible task setup. Polydectes pretended he was collecting wedding gifts for someone else, often Hippodamia, and gathered his nobles, expecting contributions like horses. Perseus, being young and not wealthy, shows up empty-handed. So Polydectes singles him out, maybe mocks him a bit, and demands the Gorgon's head instead. Specifically Medusa's head. Knowing she was the mortal sister and thus potentially killable, he totally expected Perseus to fail and die.
Sneaky. But Perseus doesn't go into this blinder alone. He gets some serious divine backup.
Crucial divine help, yeah. The gods were apparently aware of Polydectes' scheme and maybe had their own reasons for wanting Medusa dealt with. Athena, ironically.
The same goddess who cursed Medusa in Ovid's version.
Yep. She provides key aid. She gives Perseus a highly polished shield, sometimes described as mirrored bronze.
So he can see Medusa's reflection without looking directly at her, avoiding the stone gaze. Clever.
Oh, exactly. Let him see where he was going, aim his weapon without getting petrified. Then Hermes, the messenger god, he chips into, gives Perseus sandals with gold wings.
For fast travel to the Gorgon's lair at the edge of the world.
Right. And a weapon. Sometimes it's a sword from Hephaestus, the craftsman god. Other times it's an adamantine sickle from Hermes himself. Something sharp and tough enough for the job.
And Hades, god of the underworld, provides the ultimate stealth gear.
The helm of invisibility, yeah, sometimes called the cap of darkness, lets him approach unseen. The sources also sometimes mention nymphs, like the Grey, maybe, or other underworld figures, providing some or all of these magical items. Point is, Perseus was incredibly well-equipped, almost like the gods were setting him up for success against this impossible task.
Guided by divine powers. So how does the actual slaying go down? The sources describe this moment, right?
Yeah. Perseus flies to the desolate place where the Gorgons live and finds the three sisters asleep. Very carefully, using only the reflection in Athena's mirrored shield, he navigates the space.
So he sees her, positions himself, but never looks directly into her eyes, bypassing the deadly gaze.
Exactly. And many accounts say Athena's hand was actually guiding his at this critical moment, helping him aim.
Wow.
So, watching her reflection, he uses the sickle or the sword and cuts off Medusa's head. And the sources often reiterate here, this was only possible because she, unlike her sisters Theno and Uriel, was the mortal Gorgon. Her life could actually be ended.
So her mortality, the thing that made her existence tragic in Ovid's story, is also what makes her vulnerable to the hero's sword. Another layer of fate. Maybe sorrow.
Yeah. And then, from the moment of her violent death, something really remarkable happens.
Creation from destruction.
Exactly. From Medusa's severed neck, life springs forth, miraculously.
Pegasus, the winged horse.
Pegasus, yeah. The magnificent white-winged horse. And also Chrysaor, who's usually depicted as a giant wielding a golden sword.
Pegasus, one of the most famous creatures in all of Greek myth, born directly from Medusa's decapitation. That's quite a legacy to leave behind.
It adds another fascinating, almost paradoxical layer, doesn't it? Creation, powerful beings often seen as noble or heroic, like Pegasus emerging right from her violent, monstrous end. Some myths even connect Pegasus's origin specifically to Poseidon, suggesting he was Medusa's offspring by the sea god.
Oh, interesting. Making his birth from her neck like a delayed result of the original violation.
That's one interpretation, yeah. Linking her trauma directly to the symbol of beauty and freedom. But her story, or maybe the story of her power, doesn't end with her death. Her head itself keeps its terrible ability.
Right. The afterlife of the head becomes a huge part of Perseus's adventures and the myth's symbolism.
Absolutely. Medusa's severed head, still packing that potent, petrifying gaze, becomes this incredibly powerful weapon that Perseus uses on his journey home.
He busts it out quite a few times, doesn't he?
He does. According to Ovid, as Perseus is flying back over North Africa, he runs into the Titan Atlas, who's holding up the sky. Atlas threatens him, so Perseus whips out Medusa's head.
And boom, Stone Titan.
Turns him into stone, yeah. Transforming him into the Atlas mountain range that still bears his name just shows the immense power still locked in that head.
Turning a sky-holding titan into a mountain range.
Okay.
Yeah, that's powerful.
And the sources also talk about the power of her blood. Like, blood dripping from the head onto seaweed near Ethiopia supposedly hardened it, forming the corals of the Red Sea.
So even her spilled blood has this weird, petrifying, but also kind of creative, transformative power.
And dangerous power, too. Drops of her blood falling onto the sands of the Sahara Desert were said to have spawned venomous vipers. That's mentioned in texts like the Argonautica, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Lucan's Pharsalia.
Vipers from blood drops, okay.
Her blood's also said to have spawned the Amphisbaena, a mythical, venomous, two-headed, dragon-like creature.
Snakes, vipers, two-headed monsters.
Yeah.
Still very much tied to the monstrous, dangerous imagery of her origins, even after death.
Yeah. And Perseus famously uses the head when he gets challenged later. He saves Princess Andromeda from a sea monster, plans to marry her, but her uncle Phineas, who she was originally engaged to, crashes the wedding party with his followers.
Big mistake.
Huge. Perseus doesn't even draw his sword. He just unveils Medusa's head again.
Instant stone statues. Party's over.
Turns Phineas and his whole crew to stone. Ends the conflict right there. The sources also mention some variations, like one where Ariadne, maybe after Dionysus fought Perseus over her, was accidentally turned to stone by the head.
Accidental petrification. Shows it's a power that's going to be hard to control once you unleash it. Absolutely.
Definitely. And what about when Perseus finally gets back home to Seriphos, back to King Polydectes?
Right, the guy who sent him on the suicide mission in the first place.
Perseus confronts Polydectes, who's still trying to pressure Danae. Perseus reveals the head. Polydectes, and in some versions, his whole tyrannical court, or even the islanders who supported him.
Stone. All of them.
Turned to stone. Perseus then makes Dictys Polydectes' kinder brother, who actually protected Danae, the new king, so he frees his mother, gets justice.
So the tool created by a victim's curse, born from injustice, ends up being used by the hero to enact justice, or at least protection, for his mother and his allies. It's a really complex use of that power.
It is a fascinating inversion, isn't it? The source of terror, born from trauma, becomes this means of protection, justice, liberation for the hero, and ultimately, after all these adventures, Perseus gives the head away.
To Athena.
Yes. He presents the head of Medusa to the goddess Athena, who helped him get it. And Athena, in this final, really symbolic act, places the head on her shield, the Aegis.
And that image, the Medusa head on Athena's shield, the Gorgonian, becomes one of the most iconic, enduring visual symbols from all of Greek mythology.
It really does. The sources note Athena placed it right there, often in the center of the Aegis. Super prominent, super powerful symbol, and its purpose was fundamentally apotropaic.
Apotropaic, meaning it wards off evil.
Exactly. Believed to ward off evil, avert harm, and maybe most importantly for Athena, the warrior goddess, to terrify enemies. So the face of terror, the symbol of the monster born from violation and injustice.
Gets put on the shield of a major goddess and becomes a symbol of divine protection, a device to scare off enemies and keep evil away.
That is a powerful, deeply symbolic twist. The very thing that's feared is used as a defense, projecting terror outwards to protect the wearer.
Wow.
It is. And this image, the Gorgonian, especially on Athena's shield and breastplate, it had a long, prominent life in art and symbolism.
Speaking of art, how did Medusa's look evolve over the centuries? Did it track with that shift in her story, from born monster to tragic victim?
Absolutely. There's a really remarkable evolution in how Medusa was portrayed visually. It definitely reflects the changing stories and interpretations of her myth. In early Greek art, especially the Archaic period, the depictions are just explicitly, overwhelmingly monstrous.
Like that famous Gorgon on the temple pediment in Corfu, the sources mentioned?
Exactly. That iconic image, big round face, sometimes a beard, fangs or tusks like a boar, big wide eyes, maybe wings, open mouth, tongue lolling out.
Yeah, not exactly subtle.
No. These are the terrifying, grotesque features Pseudo-Apollodorus described. Fits perfectly with the early myths of her being born a monster.
And these early Gorgonia, they were everywhere, right? Buildings, pots, shields.
Yeah, that motif was incredibly common in early Greek art and culture. Temple pediment.